So a question for us to ponder today is, whom do I serve? Is it an earthly power, or is it truly Christ the King? The word in Latin, dominus, means Lord, and it's also where we get the English word dominate. So if we ask who is the dominus of my life, what or who dominates my life, a good question to ask ourselves is, where do I spend my time, my energy, and my money? It kind of shows us who is the Lord of our lives. So today is the last Sunday in Ordinary Time, and we're going to start Advent next week. And so we save one of the greatest feasts of the year for the end of the church year, Jesus Christ, King of the universe. So the three things today I'm going to focus on: Pope Pius XI, history, and our response. So Pope Pius XI established this feast in 1925, so it's almost 100 years old, but obviously the church has celebrated Jesus as King of the universe forever. But why did it start in 1925? This is very interesting. So what just happened prior to this was World War I, and the Pope started to realize that people had put their faith more in earthly powers, and it caused the loss of millions of lives. And what he was trying to show the world is there's no earthly power that should dominate us, but Jesus as King of the universe. And so he's not just the Lord of the church, he's not just the Lord of believers, but he's the Lord of everyone and everything. And so the Catechism of the Catholic Church says this. If you're doing Be Formed, you've heard this. If a leader doesn't believe in God and recognize that his or her gifts come from God, he will put himself in the place of God, and it leads to a totalitarian state. So that makes sense, right? If we have a leader who thinks that there is no God, or they're better than God, we start to have this totalitarian or dictatorship. But when you have a leader that knows that they belong to God and their gifts come from God, that's when right order comes into place. And so this is something that's really important for us to realize, that no matter what leaders we have on this earth, our focus should be on Christ, the King of the universe. He's the one, the Prince of Peace, that can give us peace in the midst of the chaos that can be around us. So let's look at the history, especially in the Old Testament prior to Christ. So from the beginning of time, God wanted to be the King of all people, and his law was put in place to establish order and to kind of guide us along the way. So in the Old Testament and the New Testament, what was the role of a king? They would maintain the covenant between God and his people. I am your God, you are my people. He would defend the kingdom from enemies. He would rule with justice to give people their due. He would teach the people. He would be a role model, and he would unite and expand the kingdom. And so if you think about that in terms of what Jesus does, we're going to get to that. But what happened in the Old Testament in this area of kingdoms? So Adam and Eve. Adam was really one of the first priests, and even though he wasn't named a king, he was meant to do those things that a king would do. But of course, we know that Adam broke the covenant. He did not defend Eve from the enemy of Satan, and sin prevented Adam from being the king that God desired him to be. Other kingly figures in the Old Testament, we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. Moses was probably the second most important figure in the Old Testament, leading up to David. But what was common among all of these leaders? They were flawed, and they were sinful, and they were imperfect leaders. So Israel saw other nations at this time, and they thought, we want a king like everybody else. And God says, you don't need a king. I am your king. I am your God, and you are my people. They said, no, we want a king. So what happened? God says, okay, you want a king? Here's Saul, but he's not going to be the kind of king that you want. And sometimes we get that too in our world, don't we? You're going to get what you desire. If we put our faith in human beings, there's going to be problems. But if we keep our focus on God, he's the one that is our true leader. And so we know Saul was very flawed, and so the people thought, okay, we need a new king, and so God gave them King David, who's probably the most influential figure of the Old Testament. If you look at the timeline, David was about 1,000 years prior to Christ. So he would be the greatest archetype of a king in the Old Testament. He united the kingdom of Israel. He worshiped God and strove to lead the people in keeping the covenant. And God promised David that someone from his line would reign forever. He tried to be a king after God's own heart. But how did he do with that? We know that he was an adulterer and eventually a murderer. And so this great king, in his fallen nature, ruined everything that God had given him. And so there were some kings after David that were from his line, but when King Nebuchadnezzar came in 586 BC, he killed Zedekiah, which was the last one in the line of King David, and David's line was done as far as leadership. And so what did the people think? God has forgotten us. You promised that there would be a king from David's line that would rule forever, and now that line is done. Brings us to the third point, our response. What did God do? We know that God sent Jesus from the line of David to be the king of the universe. If we look at the gospel today, we see this interaction with Pilate. So Pilate is representing the emperor, the Roman emperor, and the Jews have brought Jesus before him. And Pilate's like, I don't want to get involved in your religious conflict here. What is the problem? Why are you bringing him to me? And they says, he claims to be king of the Jews. And so if he is king of the Jews and he poses a threat to the emperor, then Pilate is interested. And so he poses the question to Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And we know that INRI, if you see it above a crucifix, I-N-R-I, means Jesus of Nazareth, king of the Jews. And so Jesus says, you say that I am. In other words, he's saying, you're the one who's saying it. And so Jesus goes on to say this, my kingdom does not belong where? In this world. If my kingdom did belong to this world, my attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not here. So what Jesus is saying is, if he was truly worried about being an earthly king, his followers would be fighting tooth and nail to keep him alive. You remember, going back to the Garden of Gethsemane, when they came to arrest Jesus, Peter didn't understand what was going on. And what did he do? He got out the sword, he cut off the ear of the soldier, and Jesus said, put that sword away. In other words, we're not fighting for this kingdom, but I'm going to fight in a whole new way. And what does Jesus do? He goes to the cross. His throne is the cross, and his crown is a crown of thorns. And so Pilate says, so you are a king. And Jesus says, for this I was born. Everything that the Old Testament foretold is being fulfilled in me. I'm the new Adam, I'm the new Moses, I'm the new David. Everything that you are looking for is fulfilled in me. I'm fully human and fully divine, and I've come to put order back into the world. And so this is what should give us peace today in 2024, despite the chaos around us. So if we look at what the role of a king was, look what Jesus does. So they maintain the covenant between God and his people. Jesus perfectly fulfilled the will of God the Father. The kings were to rule with justice. Jesus is the King of justice. He came, he's the way, the truth, and the life, and he judges with justice. He gives us what we're due. Kings taught the people. Jesus taught through parables, and he taught with the authority of God. They were to be a role model Of course, Jesus showed us he is the way, the truth, and the life. He shows us the way back to the Father. They defend their kingdom from their enemies. So who are the enemies of Jesus? They were both visible and invisible. The visible enemies were the Pharisees, the scribes, the Romans. The invisible enemies were, of course, the devil and his dominions. And he defeated all of them on the cross. And finally, a king was meant to unite and expand his kingdom. Remember, the 12 tribes of Israel had been scattered. Jesus chose 12 apostles to gather them back together. And then he said, after he rose from the dead, now go make disciples of all the world. And so that's our role today in 2024, is to be his faithful disciples, to allow him to love us and to form us into his faithful followers. And it's not meant to stop there, but a good king expands the kingdom. There are people out there who don't know Jesus. There are people out there that don't know what it means to follow him, to love him, and to serve him. And so the question for us today is Jesus the king of my life? Truly. Is he the king of my public life? Is he the king of my work? Is he the king of my private life? Is he the king of my family? Not just an hour on Sunday, but what Jesus should do is to inform every decision that we make throughout our lives. Also, as we look to our earthly leaders, if you look at, it's hard for us as Americans to think about kings because our country was formed in rebellion of the King of England. But if you look from George Washington all the way through Biden and Trump, these are earthly leaders, much like the kings in the Old Testament. They're fallen, sinful people. And yes, the Catechism says we should give them our respect as a place that they have as presidents of our country, but they're not the king of the universe. And so what does this mean for us as Catholics? I think it's to respect our leaders, and as Jesus says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. So for me, as a follower of Christ, whoever gets elected, now and through eternity, those are okay things, but they don't shake my faith. My faith is always in Christ, the King of the universe. So let that be our prayer today as we reflect on, whom do I serve? Is it myself? Is it some earthly leader? Or do I truly follow Christ, the King of the universe? May we give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God.